my name is Madison, and I'm going to be discussing whether languages shape thought. This is a theory-focused exploration of Japanese bilingual cognition. So in this project, I'm exploring the question, to what extent does the language we speak influence how we think? I'm focusing specifically on Japanese English bilingual speakers because they provide a unique opportunity to examine how switching between two different languages, culturally and structurally, might affect the way people frame their thoughts, emotions, and identities. This topic matters to me personally because I'm a language learner. I love studying languages as a hobby, and right now I'm completing a post-bac degree in modern languages, Japanese. So beyond a personal interest, this project is also important in applied linguistics because it connects to major areas of interest like language processing, communication, and identity. Understanding how language shapes or doesn't shape thought can help us better understand how bilinguals navigate meaning, express themselves, and build a sense of who they are across different languages. Okay, so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the idea that the structure of a language affects how its speakers perceive and categorize their experiences. It was first advanced by Edward Sapir in 1929 and later expanded by his student Benjamin Whorf. So there's two main versions. The strong form claims that language determines thought, that we're essentially trapped by our language, and the weak form suggests that language influences or shapes thought, but doesn't completely fix it into place. So a pop culture example of this idea could be shown in the movie Arrival. So spoiler alert, the main character learns an alien language with a circular writing system, and as she learns it, her perception of time itself changes and becomes how the aliens perceive time. So the human way she perceives time changes as she learns the language. In my project, I'm primarily focusing on the weak form of the hypothesis, which is more widely accepted today. Before diving deeper, I want to quickly highlight some key concepts. The linguistic relativity refers to the weak form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, like we just talked about. The idea that language influences how we think but doesn't control it. And then in contrast, linguistic determinism is the strong form, which claims the language determines thought completely. Semantic domains are groups of related words like colors or family terms, and different languages often divide these domains differently. Lexical codability is about how easily a language can express a concept. When a concept is highly codable, it's easier to access and talk about, like our brains can access it more easily. Morpheme structure deals with how languages build words from smaller meaning units, and this can affect how complex or simple a concept feels when it's being expressed. Finally, cognitive availability refers to how easily a concept comes to mind during thinking or speaking, often shaped how familiar or accessible the words for that concept are in a given language. Bilingual speakers offer a really important way to test the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis because they naturally switch between languages, a process that can also be called code switching. So when bilinguals change languages, they may also shift their cultural framing, the way they interpret social situations, emotions, or even their own identities. Some researchers argue that these shifts might simply be linguistic priming, where certain ideas are triggered just by speaking a different language. But others suggest that bilinguals sometimes think differently depending on which language they're using, which could offer real evidence for linguistic relativity in action. Okay, so in my project, I'm comparing three main theoretical approaches. So first is the weak form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which we've already talked about a lot. The idea that language influences thought, particularly like areas of how we categorize and frame our experiences. So secondly, we have the universalist approach associated with Chomsky's universal grammar. This view argues that cognitive structures are mostly the same across humans, and that language is more of a surface level tool, not something that shapes deep thought. And finally, a domain-specific approach from researchers that we'll talk about, like Imai, suggests that Language influences thought in certain cognitive areas, but not across all domains universally. Okay, so first up we're going to talk about Imai and their paper about domain-specific relativity that appeared in the Japanese Journal of Psychology. So Imai's research offers a more nuanced view of linguistic relativity. Instead of arguing that language shapes all areas of thought equally, Imai proposes that linguistic effects vary by cognitive domain, especially in areas like spatial recognition and object individuation, where language may subtly bias how we categorize and perceive information. So a good example is how Japanese uses counters when referring to objects, requiring speakers to think about an object's shape, size, material, or function every time that they describe it. In contrast, English usually just counts objects without making these distinctions. Imai also points out that humans naturally form abstract concepts even without direct sensory experience, but language can create subtle cognitive biases in how easily or habitually we access those concepts. So from Imai's perspective, rather than asking if thought is universally the same or completely different across languages, Imai suggests that we should ask where, when, and how language interacts with cognition. Okay, so next up we have the Cordoba study. In the Cordoba study, Japanese English bilinguals were asked to rapidly produce words related to sexuality in both languages. I recommend that you read this one because it's really interesting. The results showed that participants consistently produced more sexuality-related vocabulary in English than in Japanese. So there were several factors to potentially explain this. One being that English offers more simple, specific, and widely available terms for sexuality, whereas Japanese tends to either avoid really direct, specific terms, or it borrows words from English loan words, which are often longer and more complex than the original English word, like they have more syllables. According to Zipf's law, the idea that more frequently used words tend to be shorter, longer loanwords in Japanese make concepts less cognitively accessible compared to shorter English words or to the shorter English equivalents. So importantly, the bilinguals in this study found it easier to connect with and express their sexual identity in English. That suggests that lexical codability, how easily the language labels a concept, influences not just communication but also internal self-concept. So the findings from this study support the weak form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The structure and availability of language categories influence how easily people can access and express certain thoughts, especially in culturally sensitive areas like sexuality. So it raises important questions about whether language is not just shaping what we say, but how we actually experience and think about ourselves. All right, so next we have this Kitao and Kitao article. This article focuses on how cultural environment, not necessarily language and structure alone, shapes communication styles between Japanese people and Americans. One striking comparison that the author makes, referencing a study by Charles Morris, and I have the little caption on the screen here, is between landscape and portrait painting. So in Japanese culture, the setting or environment is often the focus, similar to how Japanese language often begins by establishing a setting with the key point or key action subject delayed until towards the very end of the sentence. In contrast, in English American communication, like portrait painting tends to center the individual immediately. Charles Morris found that Japanese students rated landscape paintings higher than any other kind of painting, and American students rated paintings of portraits or animals higher than any other kind of painting. So the authors of this article also explain how indirectness is a hallmark of Japanese communication. Japanese sentences are structured to de-emphasize the speaker and highlight the context, unlike English, which often puts the subject or the doer front and center right away. So Kitao ultimately argues that these patterns reflect environmental influence, but not cognitive restructuring. So in other words, it's not that Japanese speakers think fundamentally differently than Americans. It's that cultural expectations shape how languages are used to categorize information. So this perspective challenges the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis by suggesting that social norms and cultural framing, rather than the linguistic structure itself, may be what led to differences in how thoughts are expressed across languages. All right, so next we have the Scovel article. In this article, Thomas Scovel challenges the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis by arguing from a psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic perspective. He talks about decades of different experimental studies and finds, from his perspective, little evidence that linguistic differences alone can cause different patterns of thinking. Scovel critiques famous studies like Bloom's research on Chinese counterfactual thinking. So look that study up, it's interesting. And Tsunoda's claims about Japanese brain lateralization. So I have some cutouts on the screen from what he's talking about regarding Tsunoda's experiment. So he points out that when experimental flaws are corrected in these two studies, that supposed cognitive differences between language groups often disappear. A key takeaway from Scovel's argument is that we need to distinguish cultural influences from true linguistic effects. Just because two groups behave or communicate differently doesn't mean that their thought processes are fundamentally shaped by their languages, culture, and environment, are often the things that are playing a bigger role. So this perspective is important for my project, my research here, because it questions whether differences in bilingual expression, like what we see in Japanese English bilingual speakers, are really due to language structure, or whether they're better explained by broader cultural and social factors. So, point of disagreement. Across the studies that I've looked at for this, a major point of disagreement, emerges. Does language truly shape the way we think, or are differences better explained by cultural influences? Some researchers argue that when bilinguals express themselves differently across languages, that it's just priming, where the context of a language use activates certain thoughts temporarily, not a deep cognitive shift. Others suggest that the structure and availability of language categories can actually make some thoughts more accessible or even influence how people experience their own identities. Understanding whether these differences reflect momentary language effects or lasting cognitive restructuring is key to answering my main question about how language and thought interact. When a bilingual speaker switches languages, are they actually thinking differently or just reacting to the language that they're using in that moment? So as I just mentioned, priming is the idea that exposure to a particular language can temporarily activate related ideas, emotions, or ways of framing a situation. In the Cordoba study, there's some quotes that I put on the slide from participants that reflect this, if you want to take a look at those if you didn't read them the first time through. Is it potentially then a short-term effect, like a mental nudge, rather than a deep change in thought patterns? On the other hand, cognitive restructuring would mean that learning and using a second language actually reorganizes the way a person thinks or categorizes their experiences over time. This distinction matters because when bilinguals behave differently across languages, as in the Cordoba study, it's hard to know whether that's true evidence for linguistic relativity or simply a case of language priming. So understanding the difference helps us better interpret bilingual behavior without automatically assuming that language always reshapes thought. Okay, so where do these theories overlap? When we look at the different theories and studies that I've talked about here, there's actually more agreement than it might seem like at first, in my opinion. Most of the researchers agree that language can influence thought in some way, but that influence often depends on the cognitive domain, like the spatial reasoning or how we categorize objects. Where they seem to disagree more is how strong or how permanent that influence is. Some argue, again, it's just momentary priming, while others suggest that it leads to long-term cognitive restructuring. So overall, the evidence points to a more complex picture. The thought is shaped by multiple factors, including language, culture, environment, and universal cognitive processes. It's not just about the grammar or vocabulary. It's about how all of these different systems interact over time. So why this matters to applied linguistics. This topic matters because it's connected directly to language teaching, translation, and intercultural communication. If language can shape access to certain thoughts or certain ways of framing experiences, it's important for teachers and translators to recognize the potential changes or challenges that bilinguals may face when switching between languages and cultural frameworks or going other places. It also helps us better understand identity and cognition in bilingual speakers, not just how they express themselves differently, but how different languages can sometimes provide different tools for connecting to their own personal experiences, emotions, and ideas. Overall, I think this research encourages a more sensitive and nuanced approach to working with multilingual individuals and communities. Okay, so tentative takeaways or key takeaways, working thesis. Based on the sources that I've reviewed here, my tentative personal takeaway is that the weak form of linguistic relativity likely holds true, but mostly in specific emotionally or culturally coded domains, based on what I've read here. Language seems to shape access to certain thoughts, especially when those thoughts are tied to identity, emotion, or culturally sensitive topics. However, the evidence also suggests that language doesn't fully determine perception itself. People can still perceive and categorize experiences beyond what their language specifically encodes. So overall, language acts more like a filter, a lens filter, for thought in certain areas rather than a rigid barrier, maybe. Working on this project did change my perspective somewhat on how language and thought interact. Before starting it, I thought that, or assumed that learning a second language might more significantly change how someone thinks, but now I am realizing that the relationship is a lot more subtle than I thought. Like I said, language can shape access to thoughts in meaningful ways, especially around those cultural and identity topics, which is a reason why I was really excited about reading the Cordoba article. But it doesn't totally restructure perception or cognition. So another open question I'd like to explore further in the future maybe is how bilinguals might experience identity differently depending on which language they're using, not just in vocabulary access, but also in how they frame their emotions, social roles, or even memories across languages. I'm also curious about how early bilingual exposure might lead to more fluid cognitive flexibility compared to learning a language later in life. So to wrap up, my research question asks, to what extent does language influence thought? Based on the studies I explored, the answer seems to be that language can shape access to certain thoughts, particularly around emotionally charged cultural or identity concepts, those kind of important things, but it doesn't fully determine how we perceive reality. Some of the key terms that we touched on today were linguistic relativity, cognitive availability, lexical codability, and the distinction between priming and cognitive restructuring. So together, these ideas help paint a more nuanced picture of how language, culture, and thought interact with each other. And here are my references. All the studies that I talked about, you can find and read yourself using Google Scholar. So thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. I really enjoyed exploring how language, culture, and cognition interact with each other. And I look forward to learning more about these intersections in the future and doing some more research.